Hi, folks. All right. Let's get into race and ethnicity. Race is a socially defined category based on real or perceived biological differences between groups of people, and ethnicity is a socially defined category based on common language, religion, nationality, history, or another cultural factor. Humans, regardless of their race, are 99.9% genetically identical. So this argument that race is biological has been disproven. However, race is still used to classify people, and sometimes race is a basis for differential treatment of individuals or groups of people. As sociologists, we've come to realize that race as a social category based on real or perceived biological differences between groups of people. But race is more meaningful to us on a social level than it is on a biological level. There are some really, really minor differences, but the differences within groups are more different than the differences between groups. The Amish, for instance, are a distinct ethnic group in American society linked to common heritage that includes language, religion, and history. The Amish people, with few exceptions, are almost always white. On the other hand, the Jewish people, contrary to what Nazis and other white supremacists may believe, are an ethnic group, not a race. Ethnicity and race are sometimes related, but they are not inextricably linked. There are consequences to how we categorize people based on race, ethnicity, and other factors for that matter. And we'll get into those as we move forward. Some defining, how do we define race and ethnicity? These are social constructions. Race isn't based on biology. Racial categories change over time, and if you take a look at the census, you will see that the categories of races changes very frequently. In fact, in 2000, which was the first year that respondents were allowed to select one or more races in the racial category, we start to see race begin to transform. Prior to 2000, respondents were forced to select only one race, even if they would describe themselves as bi or multiracial. Racial categories never have firm boundaries. Instead, the boundaries defining racial categories are almost always flexible. The distinction between race and ethnicity is important because ethnicity can be displayed or hidden depending on individual preferences, while racial identities are always on display. It's what we see. Despite the fact that these immigrants were considered white upon their arrival, after a period of time, many of these immigrants learned to speak like Americans and took on an outwardly American lifestyle. They were able to hide their ethnicity as a way to alleviate the tensions caused by cultural classes and bigotry against them. And yet you cannot do that with a racial category. It's literally what we see, and we've constructed this reality based on that being meaningful in reference to difference. But even though that's the way we differentiate a lot of the times, there's not a whole lot of scientific or social basis for that. There are some ethnic options. You've got symbolic and situational ethnicity. Symbolic ethnicity is an ethnic identity that is only relevant on specific occasions and does not significantly impact everyday life. You may have a friend whom you've met recently who surprised you because you had no idea that she was Irish until it became time to celebrate St. Paddy's Day, when she proudly displayed her ethnicity. So we bring our ethnicity out for special occasions. Situational ethnicity, on the other hand, is an ethnic identity that can be either displayed or concealed depending on its usefulness in a given situation. Situational identity may not be relevant on a certain date, but rather based on a certain situation. For example, if you are a certain ethnicity and you know that your employer is prejudiced against people of your ethnicity, you may choose not to disclose your identity in an effort to preserve your job. These are some examples of symbolic ethnicity. On a specific day, you see these individuals coming out and dancing and celebrating that particular piece of their heritage. But maybe you wouldn't see those bright costumes and clothing and actions on any other given day. We have to, when we talk about race and ethnicity, that brings us to the concept of minority. So what's a minority group? A minority group is a social group that is systematically denied access to power and resources available to the dominant groups of society. It is not necessarily fewer numbers than the dominant group. So you can have a minority group based on lacking power, but has way more numbers than what you find in the dominant group. In South Africa, blacks dramatically outnumbered whites by a ratio of 7-1. Yet before the 1994 election of Nelson Mandela, whites controlled the country, whereas blacks occupied the lowest statuses in that society. As we think about the United States and its racial and ethnic breakup, we have about 61.3% are white non-Hispanic in the United States. 17.8 are Hispanic or Latino. 13.3 for blacks or African Americans. Asians, 5.7. Native Americans, 1.3, and 2 or more races, about 2.6%. How has that changed over time, or how will it change over time? We're expecting the black population to grow a little bit. Native Americans have been pretty flatlined for a good long time. Asians are going to increase in the United States. Whites are going to decrease, and we're going to see a major growth in Hispanic of any race in the United States by about 11%. This leads us, of course, to the concept of racism and how racism plays out in our own society. Racism is a set of beliefs about the claimed superiority of one racial or ethnic group over another. It's used to justify inequality. It's often rooted in the assumption that differences between groups are genetic. Sometimes people argue that racism is no longer an issue in the United States, but that clearly is not true. If you've been watching the news in the United States over the past 4 years, racism and race and ethnicity are at the forefront of almost everything that's happening. It's true that our race relations have changed, but many sociologists argue that racism has not been eliminated. In the past, it was socially acceptable in many places to display racist attitudes and to use racial slurs. And that's not near as politically correct as it has been in the past today. But that doesn't mean we solved all of our racial or ethnic or gender problems for that matter. And we have to be honest about where we are in order to move to someplace different, to move to a society that embraces our racial and ethnic differences versus admonishing them. Two important concepts that you really need to wrap your mind around when we get into race and ethnicity is prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is a belief, an idea about the characteristics of a group applied to all members of that group, and it's unlikely to change regardless of the evidence against it. Discrimination, on the other hand, is an action. Unequal treatment of individuals because of their social group, and it's usually motivated by prejudice. So prejudice is thinking something, and discrimination is taking that prejudicial thought and turning it into action. While it makes sense to see these things as happening chronologically or in order, it is important to know that it's not always the case. Some people may be prejudiced yet not discriminate against individuals. Others may discriminate yet not be prejudiced. For instance, a manager may refuse to hire Chinese people because other people in the office don't like them, even though the manager himself doesn't actually dislike Chinese people at all. When we get into these two categories, we really need to think about individual versus institutional discrimination. While many kinds of discrimination are problematic, institutional discrimination is bigger than individual discrimination and more difficult to address. Individual discrimination is discrimination carried out by one person against another. Institutional discrimination is systematic discrimination carried out by social institutions that affect all members of society who come into contact with it. Institutional discrimination refers to a structural disadvantage for an entire group of individuals based on their group membership. Institutional discrimination is more difficult to observe because it's not just one person acting against another. It might instead be embedded in policies, rules, traditions, or beliefs, and usually no one person can be held accountable. Therefore, eliminating institutional discrimination is a significantly more challenging task than eliminating individual discrimination. The Black Lives Matter movement is an example of institutional discrimination as it exists to oppose policies and practices of social institutions that perpetuate discrimination against racial minority groups. Racism comes in many forms. One that's becoming more prevalent, maybe not more popular, is white nationalism, which is the belief that the nation should reflect a white identity. Another thing we have to think about is white privilege, which involves unearned advantage for the dominant group. And colorblind racism is an ideology that disqualifies race and an explanatory factor for inequality. Something else we need to think about are microaggressions, which consist of everyday verbal and nonverbal communications that are denigrating or dismissive. Another important concept, cultural appropriation, which occurs when dominant group members adopt aspects of their oppressed group's culture without permission and for gain. The United States has been a cultural appropriator since our existence. Every population that we have dominated, we have in turn appropriated many of their cultural trappings and made them our own. This is very prevalent in reference to the African American experience. It doesn't take much to see, especially with regards to music, for example, of how the white culture has dominated African American culture and appropriated many of its musical forms, and now we see a historically African American form of music being played by just about every type of person in the United States. And then, of course, reverse racism is the claim by whites that they are discriminated against due to their race.